I saw Medieval Kingdoms 1212 in the chat as well, saying that they'll have a think about have a consult with their team about the accuracy, but they thought it looked great there.
Hey guys, Warman here. It's time once again to discuss the latest developments regarding Medieval 3. Boy oh boy do we have a lot to discuss this time. There's been several major bombshells since we last spoke, and we got a lot of important info. Let's not waste any time and just get straight into it. Before anything else, I just want to show the video Creative Assembly showed regarding ladders. This is excellent to see. I also love the jokes people were making about this, how they should keep it that way. As far as I'm concerned, what made it orders of magnitude funnier for me was one guy actually did have an animation. I don't know why, but that just got to me. Like the idea that this guy is the only one who was cool enough to get proper animations. Point is, this is great to see. I love how they're showing progress with this because you had a lot of people doubting it. But that's just the warm-up, because we have so much more to talk about than that. First of all, Leif has finally answered our questions. In fact, he's answered not one, not two, but 3 separate rounds of questions. The ones from a couple episodes ago, and 2 separate rounds of questions I sent his way after the roster livestream. And trust me, we'll get to that later. That means he's answered 15 questions from yours truly over the past few weeks alone. Say what you will about Creative Assembly, there's a lot to be said, and they still have a lot of goodwill to earn. But when was the last time a game developer answered 15 questions from the community in such a manner? That has to mean something, at least a little bit. And there's way too many answers to discuss all at once, so we're going to be sprinkling some of them throughout the video as we get to the relevant subjects. But I do want to discuss some of the answers now. So let's stay on the topic of sieges for a bit, shall we? Now, before we even get into the answers, I feel like it's also worth pointing out how Leif also commented on a couple of my concerns regarding sieges. We're definitely in agreement over how the settlement should be designed, and he also thought the point on wall health was interesting, which is good. Hopefully that means they're factoring that in, if they haven't already. Now let's get to the answers. Regarding whether or not siege engines can be undocked and used for other wall layers, the answer is leaning toward yes, but they're not sure yet. They're concerned over the pacing and completion time for sieges. I mean, they definitely want large sieges to be these major drawn-out clashes though. And yeah, I guess that's an understandable concern, pacing is important, but I don't see how undocking siege engines would make things slower. I mean, what are they going to do otherwise? I don't know, maybe artillery could destroy the walls, but if walls are as strong as I hope they'll be, you might want more options. If engines aren't undockable, you run the risk of forcing the player to use rams and towers on the first layer, and then just use artillery on the second, which would homogenize the whole thing, which I'm pretty sure that's not what anyone wants. But anyways, we'll see in the future what they go with, I guess. On a related note regarding sapping, the answer is actually quite interesting. They can't say anything definitive, but they're hoping to represent sapping. Although it's slightly different than I think people are expecting. But, to be honest, I kinda like it more. Because they want to have it be more like on the campaign side of things, as part of siege engines, which itself they plan on having more options for just constructing siege engines and sorting out the enemy. Like, we've talked about that before. If you're concerned that sapping is not going to be represented during the battle, don't worry. The final moments of the sapping and the collapse would still be part of the battle, something you could trigger during it. To be honest, that sounds excellent. I hope that's what they go with. Sapping, like many aspects of sieges, took months. And let's be honest, having the whole thing play out during the battle would be very cartoonish. I'm just imagining these guys like going comedically like fast through the earth. Like, come on, that would be silly. There's nothing else more to say, we just have to see how they execute it. Hopefully it's not too overpowered. Otherwise, what would be the point of anything else? There should be several points of failure, like your sappers could get intercepted by enemy troops and are forced to retreat, or bad rhetoric can cause collapses prematurely. Oh, and maybe you could have that reflected on the battle map, like have there be some indentations in the ground or something. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to stick to the siege stuff for a little bit longer and talk about a new type of siege possibly coming to Medieval 3, castle sieges. Now, I said new type of siege for a reason, because this isn't the same as Medieval 2's castle sieges. There was some confusion over this on the live stream, so let's skip the spinning wheels and just move on to this follow-up post. Basically, it's looking like 2 kinds of sieges, settlement sieges and castle sieges. The former are more the traditional kinds of sieges over a city, and these can vary greatly in size, with the biggest ones having multiple wall layers, a citadel in the keep, etc. Castle sieges are small-scale endeavors, like attacking Warburg or Dover Castle. The layouts would be different, the battles much smaller, and potentially a different experience. Nothing is set in stone about this though. They're still deliberating whether or not there should be a true new battle type or folded into the settlement sieges in some way. I personally think it can function on its own. If it really leans into the small scale type conflict thing, and it's predicated on castles that are largely on their own with no settlement, which is what Leif mentions as well, so that could work, yeah, I don't see why not. I think as long as it's not so rigid, like a castle could become a settlement in its own right or something, like the type of siege can change as the fortress changes, I think it might be a useful addition. Once more, I love the genuine attempts to seriously innovate sieges this time around. This is what historical Total War needs. But as always, everyone, let's see if they can pull it off. Anyways, let's move on to another question. This one is kind of an outlier because most of the remaining answers we need to talk about relate to factions or rosters. This one is regarding how the conflict between the Welfs and Stalfors is going to be handled in the game, especially since during this starting year a civil war was ongoing. The answer went in an interesting direction. First of all, Leif mentions that certain conflicts may need special treatment, citing both the Welfs and the Stalfors conflict as well as the Guelphs and Ghibellines. But what is arguably the more interesting point is we got some details on how inter-realm politicking might work. There's a lot of emphasis on families and dynasties here, and different families have different political agendas, which are basically glorified traits, and these different traits can cause friction and clashes between families. As for an example, I'm just going to read what Leif says verbatim. One dynasty may support the Pope, the others may oppose him. These different leanings then manifest as part of what we call political agendas or political plays, where a dynasty may bring forth a political motion. We should allow some of our castles to a holy order and let them own lands within our realm. A God-fearing dynasty may support this, whereas a dynasty that opposes control of the Catholic Church would be against it. Other dynasties might join and support either side. Dynasties try to sway each other over time, and the player, representing the crown and realm in these plays, can try and meddle and sway other parties too. These plays have a variety of outcomes, the strongest of which would be a full-on civil war. This is one of the ways we want to get that classic escalation across where a little dispute can boil into a realm-defining civil war that changes the course of history. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. Like always, we need to see how it's executed. Speaking of factional infighting, I just want to go over some other posts and answers Leif has said lately, and this is going to be our first foray into factions in this video. God knows, we're still trying to figure out how this is going to work, and I swear every answer we get just raises more questions. So first of all, Leif has made it clear you're playing as the realm, not the family. So for example, in France, you're playing as, well, France, not the Capets. And as we saw in Civil Wars, I think you'll be able to choose sides. There was a brief discussion over this in the 1212 coverage thread, where I was just trying to process how this was all going to work, and we ended up on the topic of Egypt, because that is a completely different circumstance from something like France. Leif describes the Mamluk takeover of Egypt as a succession crisis where if the Mamluks won, your flag and name changes. However, the realm is still Egypt, even if it's not overtly called that. And this also led us to a whole can of worms of a topic regarding the rise of Saladin and the Ayyubids, because especially with the Muslim realms, a lot of this is very tricky and there's certain nuances that cannot be overlooked. Like with many of these realms, the dynasty is pretty heavily tied into the faction itself, which is very different from something like France. But there's other factors to consider too, and one thing I think we can all agree on is there's no easy answer to this. To elaborate on this point, I'm just going to read a statement of sorts from fellow Monty member You Guess Who, because he's way more knowledgeable on these areas than me, and he sums it up better than I ever could. Truly, there is no easy way. Using the modern conception of regional states is dangerous. Pray tell, if you're the Great Seljuk, are you the Turks or Iran? If you're playing against the Fatimids, there's no way you let some Kurds, dogs of the Zengids, walk in and coup your state. You'll load an earlier save. Logically, both as the computer player and the dynasty in history, if you start Fatimid, you'll stick to the Fatimids. End of story. Nor if you're the Turan Shah of the Ayyubids, letting Sajar ad-Dur, oh please forgive me if I mispronounced that, and some upstart Mamluks take Egypt. Nor if you're a Seljuk letting some small-time chieftain named Osman Ghazi running from the Mongols to become the ruler of Anatolia. The internal coup idea, he stated, would only work if dynasty and its tradition is separate to the region and its culture. Plus the mechanic of playing as the faction that separates or conquers you. Again, one issue of a grand strategy game is the player will not play a falling trajectory. He'll load a previous save. Hardcore players like challenge, but that translates to playing an underdog faction or a crumbling giant, e.g. the Russian Roman Empire and Attila, from the very beginning. The line must go up. Defeat means not playing anymore. Back when I played Civ 4, there was this mod, Rise and Fall of Civilization. Here, if your civilization falls, you'll be transferred into another civilization. Suddenly, a defeat is not the end. It becomes a turning point in continuing a failing campaign. So imagine if there's a mechanic, and that as the civil war occurs, you get the option of picking sides. If your starting dynasty is vanquished by an outsider, you could keep playing as one of your former vassals instead. Now there's an interesting mechanic. The easy way though is simply having alternating start dates so you can play as the Fatimids, Ayyubids, and the Mamluks. So yeah, interesting stuff to consider. I will also point out that I'm a little bit concerned that there's going to be a lot of railroading when it comes to Egypt, because Leif mentions a lot of stuff with the Mamluk Sultanate, and those guys weren't a thing till like a century after the game starts. We'll have to see how they handle it. And yeah, some of these concerns obviously go beyond this region too. And again, I hope there'll be some good incentive to letting the newcomer take over, because otherwise, yeah, what's the point of it? There's more stuff to talk about with factions, but I want to save that till later. Right now, let's finally get into the recent livestream. Before we get to the main subject of the livestream, I just want to briefly mention that naval battles are confirmed, but not on launch. So they might be a DLC. We'll see. I personally don't mind not having naval battles, and I do think a lot of people have rose-tinted glasses regarding them in Total War. They were low-key phased out for a reason, in my opinion. But hey, it's a new engine, and who knows, maybe they can do them better this time. And just to preempt something here, know my dismissiveness of naval battles is not what's caused the delays with it for our mod. It has nothing to do with it. Also, it is kind of funny to me that despite how long it's taken us to get naval units ready, we're still probably going to have them before Medieval 3. Fate deals a strange hand, I guess. But that's not the highlight of the stream. Oh no, the main event was the rosters. I've been waiting for this for months. Last video we talked about my concerns with this and how this was going to be handled in the game. I had my hopes, I had my concerns. I knew what was said so far, and I knew how we approach historical accuracy is not the same as Creative Assembly. Or so I thought. We'll get to that. So going into this live stream, I didn't know what to expect. I tried to go into this as neutral and level-headed as I could. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best, right? I think this has been the best Medieval 3 update we've gotten, by far. I will go on record saying I'm very, very impressed with what was said and what was shown. All of us on the team are. It's not perfect and there's some slight issues I'll get to later, but if they can stick to this vision, Medieval 3 could be the most historically accurate Total War we've gotten yet. If they can stick to that vision. So let's summarize what was said. Note, I am also going to be integrating the information that Leif has given in response to my questions, which gives more details and elaborates on certain things than was given in the original post and livestream. So even if you saw the livestream, please stick around because there's going to be new info. So first of all, units have deep ties to the populations of the region. They want to make it feel like the units and formations are tied to the people actually living in your lands. So a manpower system. Great to see it making a comeback. Although I think we already knew that. Units can be boiled down to 4 categories: cultural group, faction block, culture, and faction. Cultural group is extremely broad, and this mostly applies to lower tier militia and or peasant units. I speculate artillery units will also fall under this in some capacity. Faction block is basically a thing for low to mid tier units, and this is similar to how we handle factions in our mod, dividing things by region. Leif mentions French and Imperial faction blocks, where all factions, major and minor alike, will have access to these units. It's meant to give these regions a local flavor. See what I mean? That's very similar to how we do it. One major addition is the concept of cultural units, which we've discussed before, but we finally got some more details on this. So they're kind of similar to area of recruitments from Rome 2 or the native viewers from Pharaoh, except they're more tied to people and not locations, and the unit permissions are tied to several factors pertaining to the culture and its people. Like there needs to be enough people from that culture in the area, and this could come from a variety of factors like trade, migrations, events, politics, etc. An example Leif gives is Mamluk Egypt accepting aspects of the Italian culture, and thus they get some Italian units, and how this can have a ripple effect when new factions enter the area, and how they can continue what you started. In this case, he mentions the Timurids, and having the Timurids take up those same Italian traditions as well. Now, I would personally chime in real quick and say that I hope this doesn't get too insane, because otherwise things would get too wacky and it wouldn't be grounded at all, but we'll see. Back to the point, regardless of how you do it, this is all built around the concept of needing to accept customs, which is similar yet different than edicts because you can have multiple going on at once. And I presume this will be in reaction to the aforementioned factors like migrations, and that can be pushed back if you're too tolerant to other cultures. Again, as depressing as it is, that makes sense. Other details of note are that cultural units can be from any class or walk of life. They plan on having up to 5 or 6 different cultures per region. region, and 1 to 3 units per culture. Enough so these units can become mainstays with your armies but not hijack the roster. We also know what the 5 cultural groups are for the Holy Roman Empire: the Flemish, the Franconians, Bohemians, Swiss, and Saxons. While any faction can recruit these units if they play their cards right, they're apparently being lumped in with the Imperial rosters from a roster structure standpoint, which is kind of interesting. And that leads us to the last category of units, factional, which is pretty straightforward. With so much unit sharing and overlap, Leif stressed they still want to maintain some meaningful faction identity in Medieval 3, so some units will well and truly be faction exclusive. The examples given include English Longbowmen and Imperial Knights. Right, real quick again before we go forward, please remember that France did have archers Med-free team. They might not have been as good as the English longbows, but they still had them, so don't nix them entirely, please. Another thing to note about the roster structure is they have a system similar yet different to ours. They have what I'm calling a 4-tier system, unlike our 3. There's the start, early, mid, and late. And early, mid, and late correspond pretty heavily with our tier system, with early being the 1200s, mid the 1300s, etc. They said they want to have a sense of progression with the rosters because this is a time frame of change and evolution. Armor was changing, formations and technology were developing, the rise of professional armies and the like. They want the player to be able to read this visually as well as mechanically. On a related note, equipment upgrades are making a comeback, and they're going to be fleshing this out by having this almost be an extension of that progression. Better manufacturing leads to better equipment, which leads to better units. They don't just want to be a buff though, they want to represent crucial progression and transition points for that unit. As if all that information wasn't enough, we also got insight over how they've been putting the rosters together. They once more state they're using manuscript miniatures and its sibling websites, same as us, and after that they've been cross-referenced their work with previous titles, as well as some mods, to evaluate how they handled certain choices. And we will get back to that in a moment. Each stage they go over and examine the choices. Is the theme of the faction coming through? Is the progression meaningful? Is the roster balanced or is it lopsided? They may also move units around from faction to faction block, or faction block to culture, etc. It's also around this time that they make the thumbnail sheet that we saw in the very beginning. Then this gets reviewed by their historical consultant. Speaking of, they recently got the assistance of Dr. Tobias Capwell. That's excellent news right there. The guy knows his stuff, and we'll get back to that in a sec as well. Once they got the green light, they move on to the final concept art, which is stuff like this, and then to the 3D assets, etc. So that's a lot of info, and we're still not done, because we got a lot of concept art in this. We got concept art of the Ministrales, which is a faction unit, the Kofenstoffers, which are an example of a cultural unit, and apparently one that comes about in the mid-game, meaning cultural units can come and go as the period progresses, if I understand that right. And lastly, we have another factional unit with the Imperial Knights. Apologies that some of this art is higher quality than others, not everything shown in the live stream was put on the post. One thing that they showed a lot in the live stream that we don't see that much like in the post are these comparison shots, where we can see how the feedback from Dr. Capro was integrated into the designs, which is really cool to see. It's a perfect way to literally illustrate how they were taking the feedback to heart. And there's still more to talk about before we go into my thoughts and observations. In the wake of the live stream, like I said earlier, there was 2 rounds of questions I asked. Some of these I've already went over in the earlier section, but there's several other answers that are also relevant to this, and this was very validating. For a lot of this, I'm just going to read what he says verbatim. I asked Leif if he could elaborate on how previous mods and games affected the roster making process. I think one element that mods have gotten more right in the past is what we call the window to the world, really appreciating the nuances of the world, reflecting player choice, and giving you nuanced layers to manipulate the world. This speaks to all kinds of features and mechanics, of course, but also applies to the unit rosters and how it's integrated in-game. There's obviously a balance of getting too much into the weeds. In the community Q&A yesterday, Roger spoke about the challenge of onboarding and getting new players into our games. So Total War games have to tread the middle ground between accessible history and nuanced realness. Not an easy task, and mods have greater freedom to lean into the latter. The classic example here is unit names, something even mods have wrestled with over time. I believe DEI has multiple versions for its unit naming. With Medieval 3, there's still a balance we need to achieve here, but I would say we are moving the needle towards the latter more so than before. There's a lot to say about historical authenticity and historical accuracy, but this isn't even about that. This is about ensuring the world responds to your actions. This adds to the authenticity of the world, especially in a historical sandbox, and creates much more compelling stories. So it turns out, yeah, I was wrong. They are indeed going for a bit more historical accuracy this time than I thought. And that is excellent news. Now, if you're someone who doesn't care for historical accuracy and is concerned it's going to make the game less fun or interesting or make it harder for you to onboard into, allow me to ease your concerns. The dichotomy that says you have to make something either historically accurate or visually interesting is a myth. You can have both, especially if you really try and put the effort into it. And you guys are going to find that if they stick to this approach, the efforts will be worth it. Next question, I went for the jugular and I asked, what mods did they look at? One mod I really loved and played a good amount back in the day is Europa Barbarum 2. Wrong time period, yes, but systematically that mod did a lot of interesting things. The way the mod handles different government types and culture/cultural units was certainly a bit of an inspiration. Not in terms of literal mechanics, two very different base games and systemic foundation, but in terms of player experience and vibe, it was inspiring. Stainless Steel and MK1212, I don't even have to mention, of course. We certainly look at these mods, and marvel at what you guys are doing, to reflect on the choices you've made, within the limitations, and see what we can learn from it for med-free and our goals for the project. And there we have it, my friends. And if that isn't validating, I don't know what is. Pretty much from the very beginning, there's been people saying that the med-free team should look at our mod, that they should reach out to us, and for the record, we're still down with them doing that. And you have some people even more boldly thinking that Creative Assembly should hire us. And I'm gonna have a video talking about that subject at a later date. But we can finally put this to rest. They already have looked at our mod and will probably continue to do so. It's actually great timing that the anniversary update is around the corner, because that's actually going to be addressing a lot of the Middle Eastern factions, because that's the area they're heading to next apparently. So yeah, the timing is perfect. Also, the fact they looked at Stainless Steel is a smart decision as well. Especially if you're watching this and don't care for newer Total War games, I'm sure that's got to be great news for you. Building on this was my question about what their favorite faction and rosters was so far and why. And this one went into an unexpected direction, because I wasn't talking about the rosters for mods or previous titles, I was asking about what they had done for Medieval 3 so far. But I can't really complain, because this was the answer. I'll let Oscar speak first, who is the design owner of the Holy Roman Empire roster for Medieval 3. For me and previous meds, it's probably been the Byzantine roster. They've always been a melting pot of different units, making them a versatile faction that can be playable in many ways. That adaptability means you often have to change both army composition and tactics against different enemies to do it well. Plus, I love the look of Cataphracts. Since I used to mainly be a multiplayer nut, I mainly played on the Med 2 base game and not so much of mods. For myself, I would say I have really fond memories of the Qualmazanian Empire and Stainless Steel. I'm a simple man. I see epic face masks and I'm in. But I do really like what you guys have done with the Jerusalem roster in MK1212. Similar to Oscar's answer, I do really enjoy melting pot kinds of rosters where you can feel a lot of different cultural influences and hybrid type units. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. It's funny because Jerusalem was one of the last factions I worked on directly. It also needs a model update badly, but in terms of the structure of the roster, yeah, I think it actually holds up. So that's awesome to hear. Back to this concept art, there's other stuff to talk about. Like, we got this really big character sheet as well as this graph too, which are deliberately unreadable because they don't want people to make assumptions based on what's been shown. Probably for the best, especially since the art seen here is clearly the pre-capital feedback version. But we still get some neat glimpses of other units and tiers, like I can sort of see the earlier tier versions of the Knights, and you can also clearly see Gothic Knights at the bottom there. We also have this cluster of units here, one of whom is the Covenstoffers, but many of these other units are mysteries. Some of these are in the same century, I don't know what these are. Blue means faction block, by the way, and red means cultural. The text isn't readable, but I think it's the same unit multiple times. If that's the case, my theory is what we're seeing is the armor progression in action. If I'm right, that means there could be upwards of 3 different progression layers on top of the tiers. Seriously, this unit is only a thing on 2 tiers and has 4 progressions between the 2 tiers. Wow. Your guess is as good as mine as what these units are specifically though. You notice none of this art has weapons and shields, and I can confirm that's because shields would block the body, and apparently some of these units are going to share shields. So yeah, we have no idea. Alright, I think I got everything. As you can see, this was a lot. Even writing the script for this video has been a headache because of how much there is to say before we even get into our thoughts on it. And you better believe we have a lot to say, and since Leif is literally asking people for their thoughts, well, asking you shall receive. So let's go over this beat by beat. As I said, this is a really solid approach to rosters. I'm going to start calling this the 4x4 approach. 4 unit categories and 4 periods. 4x4. This answered so many questions and adds a lot of nuance to rosters like I've never seen before. Every category is solid and makes sense. My only issue is what could be classified as what. I'm not at all surprised they're still shuffling things around right there, and I have my own 2 cents on that, which we'll get to later. Their period system is so similar to our tier system, and faction blocks are almost exactly like our approach to regions. While I don't think they took inspiration from us on a conceptual level, I do think they took some reference from us just because, for all intents and purposes, we gave them a good prototype. Our systems are so similar, why wouldn't you take reference from it? And to be honest, that's close enough for me. And besides, irrespective of whether or not it's a coincidence, they're using the same terms, early, mid, and late, and it corresponds to the same centuries as our mod. Seriously, this is going to make it very easy for someone to transition from playing our mod to playing med free, since they're already going to be familiar with the terms and they carry over. The sheer amount of planned culture surprised me. What I'm not surprised by is the amount of units per culture. Seriously, like when you have 5 or 6 different cultures per region, you have to compromise somewhere, so having only 1 to 3 units per culture is an acceptable price to pay. Now, I will say, however, that I don't think you can have 5 cultures for every area, not without shafting factions or groups that will probably deserve to be playable. I mean, France, I think you can get away with 5. Go for the Bretons, Gascony, Occitan, which may or may not be like Toulouse, maybe the Flemish again, and maybe like Burgundy or Aquitaine. But going to something like the British Isles, I can see only like 2 or 3 cultures that would be significant enough. The Irish and the Welsh. Maybe Scotland if it isn't playable, which I don't know if that would be a good idea. Scotland is a popular faction. And we also need to consider the possibility that cultural units may not be so, shall we say, factionally coded. For example, I could see the Maronites being a cultural group for Jerusalem, and that's not really tied into a specific faction. Also, it's possible that the Mamluks might be cultural units if that post from a few months ago still stands. We'll go back to the Mamluks at a later date, because right now you guess who needs to think it over what will be the best approach for them, and I don't want to rush him with that because he's working on stuff for the mod. We'll talk about the Mamluks another day. If they do plan on having Gothic Knights in the game, I would like to officially request that you guys change the end year from 1440 to like 1470 or 1480. I understand that even that slight difference might be too ambitious, but if you're making stuff like Gothic Plate, you're already putting the work in for that anyways, you might as well commit to it. Now as for the units themselves, they look great, okay? They certainly passed the looks good on its own merits test easily, and despite some issues we'll get to in a moment, the overall impression is really damn good and about as accurate as our mod, or at least close. I mean, our mod isn't perfect by any means, but people do view our mod pretty highly in this regard. Unfortunately, I actually had a hard time comparing our units to the concept art here. This was the closest I could do. It's still not quite the same because ours have more plate and we handle certain things differently, especially when comparing the Knights, where we basically combine the Imperial and Gothic Knights. So it's hard to compare similar variants here. Now that doesn't necessarily mean what Crave Assembly did was less accurate. It could just simply mean we based our units off a different point in the century from what Crave Assembly did. Because that actually does matter, and that's why I made that suggestion about the Gothic Knights. Gothic plate was a thing at the end of the 1400s, not the beginning. You see what I mean? You could have very different results depending on what you go with. In general though, like I said earlier, I feel like this could raise the standard of accuracy we see in vanilla historical titles. Mods will always have a place to go further, but having the base game be that much more solid out of the gate is a very pleasant surprise. Now we're still far from done. Let's go over the issues with what's been seen or said, because nothing is perfect and this is no exception. A lot of this goes into nitpick territory, so please don't get worked up or annoyed here. If you don't care about these little details, fine, but I'm still going to talk about it for documentation's sake. So, as to be expected, there's a lot of little details on these units that still isn't right. And this is by no means a complete list of issues, by the way. We have a helmet design here, the way the surcoats are there, the banding on these helmets shouldn't be there. Belts, according to some people on our Discord, are apparently an area that needs some work. So certain aspects of these units that are slightly anachronistic, some of these are from the wrong region, like this is a French helmet, not a German one. Again, these kind of issues are to be expected. Watch the belts thing become the next generation of the Roman sandals complaint. I do think it's important to recognize that these are the same kind of complaints we get too. So just because there's issues like this, that doesn't mean the overall impression still isn't accurate and good. One strange decision I noticed is if we look at this army lineup here that's supposed to be like the mid-game, we have the term Barbican pikemen. Presumably this is an example of a Flemish unit, and this is where I'm confused, because the category is Flemish, as in the Flemish people. That's why Leif went with that instead of the more broad Low Counties. I know this because I asked, but the Barbican were named after men from Brabant, which is another Low County in the Holy Roman Empire, but obviously not Flanders. I mean, yeah, the Barbacan technically came from other places in Northern Europe, not just bearer bands, but that still means they're not Flemish, at least not exclusively. These guys were also mercenaries, which is a unit type that's already going to exist in Medieval 3, and is separate from stuff like culture. Now, I do like the idea of having a Flemish pike unit being their cultural unit representation, so I would suggest moving the Barbacan over to the mercenary pool and turn this pike unit into guild pikemen instead, or at the very least go with regular Flemish pikemen. That way you have something more accurate reflective of the direction of the unit. The guilds give a perfect vector for increasing cultural influence. Build the buildings for the guilds, you get the units. And unlike the Barbacan, these guys lasted the entire game's time frame, unlike the Barbacan, which fizzled out after the 1200s. And real quick, before we get to my other complaints, I just want to give some suggestions for units since Leif asked. This is by no means a complete list, but I just want to touch base on some good candidates. Sticking with the Flemish for a moment, of course, again, you have like the Golden Doggers units, and just like their pike counterparts, some of these are guilds, some of these are just regular militias. There's also other units from Flanders, some notable like swordsmen and other melee infantry. Ranged units, you get some interesting stuff. Some of these are guilds, some of these are religious orders. It's just stuff to consider. Burgundy, I feel like could justifiably be a good cultural grouping of France. They have a lot of good ordnance units, especially like in the 1400s, that could make them stand out and be a bit fresh from their French counterparts. Everything about the Swiss, you have so many good candidates with pikemen and halberdiers and just other stuff like that. England has stuff like the Yeomen of the Guard. The French also has similar companies like the Scots Guard. The Iberians, again, you have like Almogavers, including like notable ones like the Catalan Company. So yeah, so you have some good skirmishing units in that regard. Those could be great representations of the Catalan subculture, which I hope is going to be a thing with the Iberians. Going to Venice, because Venice, out of all the Italian factions, is the one that's probably going to be the most playable. We have, of course, the Fanti de Mar, aka the Venetian Heavy Infantry. We also have the Excusati Guard, which is basically Venice's attempt to answer the Varangian Guard with mixed success. Could give them some Byzantine influence. Going to Milan, we have stuff like the Deaf Company and the Company of the Carrico. Gonna probably mispronounce that. And yes, the Deaf Company was not the same as the Company of the Carrico. They were two different units. And to be honest, looking at the Deaf Company here, these guys look absolutely metal. These guys look like something straight out of Warhammer, but no, this was an actual thing. Going to Central Europe, we have stuff like the Hungarian Black Army, just everything about them. There's the Hussites and their famous war wagons, can't go wrong there. Going to the Middle East, again, like stuff like the Janissaries need no introduction. There's all sorts of types of slave soldiers that can make for interesting stuff. Of course, you have the various crusading orders, and these ones need no introduction, but stuff like the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Order, of course. There's more obscure orders too, like the Cans of the Holy Sepulchre and the Knights of St. Lazarus. There's so much potential there. Again, the aforementioned Maronites, Turco-Poles, and that's just like stuff on the top of my head, okay? Like there are so many candidates, and I think you guys already know about many of these things because since I know you've seen our mod, but yeah, like there's a lot of stuff you can use. Now, back to the issues. Based off this line here, I think this means we're gonna have mounted and dismounted versions of these units, which I actually don't like. I mean, I know Knights did dismount sometimes, but they usually didn't. Now, I know many rosters in our mod have dismounted versions, but we did this because the AI doesn't use dismounting, ever. Dismounting is just one of those mechanics that led nowhere, but I was really hoping Medieval 3 could innovate on that. Sadly enough, I don't think it's happening now, but we'll see. Also, I don't know if this weapon choice makes sense either. Shouldn't they be using like pole weapons or two-handed swords when they're on foot? Also, I asked if knights were gonna have the coat of arms of their families or if they would just be factional and or regional. Sadly enough, the answer is leaning toward no. Sort of. They said that factions and vassal/dynasties are the two main layers of rivalry and heraldry. However, they might need to change that up a bit, since Imperial Knights apparently can't have the emblems of the Emperor like this. So they might have to change it up for variety. Or they just might just take the creative liberty and save themselves the trouble. We'll see. This is where I'm of two minds. On the one hand, going with the coats of arms of the various families and stuff is more historically accurate and visually interesting. I typically don't like games where knights are wearing the livery of the faction. It just feels too artificial and gamey for my taste. I think the best you can get with that is something like how they portray the Bretonnians, but still. Now, I would be a little bit more annoyed at this, but this is one of those areas of Medieval 3 I made my peace with long ago. We gotta look at the other aspect of this, and this is why I totally understand why they would nix the idea. It would be a lot of work for comparatively little payoff. And this, more than anything perhaps before, is where my experience of working on this mod is important from my perspective on how I view the development of Medieval 3. We've been giving knights coat of arms of their respective areas from the very beginning when it was just me fiddling with open source models, and it's still something we do today, and it's a lot of work. It's one of those things where mods can kind of pull it off better because they have more time. Fun fact, in the earliest days of this mod, I did 25 variants for the various knight units. By the end of it, I was only doing like 10 to 15. Let me walk you guys through this. Let's go with a knight unit from the 1200s, let's say Burgundy. For each knight, you need the texture for the surcoat, the shields, the alets, the flag on their lances. Balding on the horses is also a thing, but I don't know how interconnected mounted riders are going to be in Medieval 3. If you're in Iberia or Germany, you might also have to put a colored helm in the mix too. So that is a bare minimum of 3 to 4 textures for one knight. Let's lowball the variant count and say there's only going to be 10. That's still 30 to 40 textures for a single unit of a single period of a single faction. And different periods have different shields and surcoats, which in turn would need more work done too. So there isn't going to be that much overlap. That is simply too much for a little game, at least by the metrics of game developers who have other things to do and deadlines to meet. As a result, this is one of several areas of Medieval 3 that I made my peace with. I really wasn't expecting them to do this, so if we get anything at all with it, I'll be impressed. Honestly, depending on how easy it is to mod, I might just make a mod for this myself. I don't have any bigger modding ambitions for Medieval 3, but I might still do something like that. We'll see. As you can see, we did have some issues with what was shown. However, even considering all that, this was excellent. Like I said, I am very impressed with what was shown, and I hope Creative Assembly keeps up this standard for all the factions in this game. I'm eager to see what's going on with the Iberians because it's been a while since we've seen anything from them. I'm eager to see the latest concept art or maybe even the 3D art at this point. I'm sure we'll see it eventually. Before we wrap this up, there's several more answers from Leif I need to mention, and it's going to tie everything together. Hopefully. I'm trying to not have this video be all over the place. These answers were in the same post where Leif talked about sappers and the Stoffels and Welfs. He also answered 3 more questions regarding factions. I asked if the internal/external vassal system was going to be around the whole map or just in Europe. Basically, they're building the systems of cultural nuances in mind, so it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach here. So what an internal vassal means in terms of power, whether or not they can hold multiple regions, or just be a title with permissions and effects will depend on the region. Besides Europe, Leif mentions the Byzantine Thames, forgive me I mispronounced that, which could be internal vassals as well. Nuance is always good, and here's hoping they can follow through with that. Once more, I should note that many of the bigger Muslim powers had vassals in a similar vein as their European counterparts, so hopefully that will be reflected. The last 2 answers we're talking about today also relate to factions, and they go hand in hand. I asked if there was a size requirement for a faction to be playable, and do they have a rough number of planned factions. The answer to the first is there isn't a size requirement. It's more about the iconicness of a potential faction, not the size. And Leif name drops Venice. Which, yeah, I should have known better. As for the other question, as expected it's too early for them to decide on that, but they're going to look at previous historical titles for inspiration, and also maybe bring back unlockable factions too? That one was mostly what I expected, aside from the detail on unlockable factions. That one I wasn't expecting, but hey, I like the sound of it. The more details we get about factions, man, it's like it gets more interesting the more info we get. Now, I've said this before, but factions are a strange beast in Medieval 3, and rosters seem to be too. We've talked before about internal vassals and the implications of that, but with this information and the cultural units, the plot thickens even more. One of the many reasons I've been so obsessed and curious about factions in Medieval 3 is because, well, Medieval 3 is actually in a bind in this regard. I haven't said it, but it's there. And depending on how you view it, it's partially our fault. Let me explain, okay? Most Total War games have had the same amount of factions, ranging from 10 to 14-ish. Older titles had a few more, but many of these weren't playable on the campaign map. Medieval 2 is a sort of outlier since that has 17 playable factions in the campaign. These days, a lot of factions have just been added with DLCs instead, and this has nearly doubled the playable number in places, but obviously these are paywalls, something a lot of people famously don't like. Then comes our mod, which has dozens of factions, and one of our biggest points of pride is you don't need any of the DLCs to play them. All you need is the base game of Attila and you're golden. I know that there are some people that take issue with our approach, saying we have too many factions or many factions play too similarly, and perhaps those points are fair, but sadly enough most people simply like having the bigger number and don't want it to go down. Point is, I think that's put Medieval 3 in a weird spot when it comes to expectations. One of the biggest points of disillusionment I've seen with Medieval 3 is the likelihood that there's going to be DLC faction packs like before. I've personally made my peace with this, like you can still have it be a good game despite that, but I wouldn't begrudge other people for seeing that as a massive problem. And the only thing we know for sure that isn't happening is that there's not going to be any pre-order bonus factions this time. But anything post-launch is fair game. But even if the factions were always going to be free, like they don't plan on having any faction DLCs, there's no way the Med-free team can make so many playable on launch. So no matter what, there's going to be this potential whiplash that could happen when going from our mod to Medieval 3. Some of you might be thinking I'm being a bit too presumptuous and arrogant here, since mods have different expectations and circumstances than a game. But the sad thing is, if you do think that, yeah, that's correct, but way too many people don't see it that way. People still treat this project like it's a game, and they treat us as devs. They still struggle to understand that we're modders making a mod, not developers making a game. Every video I post on here, I see at least 2 or 3 people complaining about the lack of progress and treating us like a game. You get people that even refer to us as a game. So in other words, people are a bit, shall we say, misguided about this. And like it or not, you can't just put your head in the sand and ignore that context. That's not how that works. You can't just ignore that. So the Med-free team is in this weird spot where they have to be realistic with their goals as a professional game dev studio, while balancing historical accuracy with accessibility, while also balancing players' expectations and desires, which thanks to our mod are now probably way too high. Seriously, I do not envy the Med-free team's position with this. And this is also why I'm so fascinated and intrigued by all these developments. I've been waiting to see how they were going to solve this problem, and so far I'm not disappointed. I think the existence of internal vassals, regional retinues, and cultural units are various ways the Med-free team is trying to soften the blow and reduce that whiplash, assuming they weren't just done because it's in the spirit of feudalism. But quite frankly, I don't see why it can't be both, because both these systems give ways to play as factions, or at least units of a faction, without making that faction fully playable. The poster child for what I'm saying is Bohemia. Here is a faction that's probably going to be an internal vassal because of the duchy. As such, you're playing as them when you're playing as the Holy Roman Empire. Now consider the fact that Bohemia has cultural units as well, and also the regional retinue system exists, so even the faction block units hailing from Bohemia are going to have Bohemia's colors and emblems, at least partially. Suddenly now you have a faction that's not a faction with a roster that's not really a roster. The mechanics give you an opportunity to play as Bohemia even though they're not a true faction. And if Bohemia eventually takes over the Imperial Crown, which I feel like is theoretically possible with the systems in Medieval 3, now suddenly you're playing as Bohemia as a full faction. Now, as a slight side effect of this phenomenon, I think that any quasi-faction, at least any faction that has a cultural grouping like this, is probably not going to be playable. So if you were hoping for a playable Flanders or Bohemia, like as their own faction, I think the answer is likely no. Again, I don't want to say for sure, but based off everything I've seen, I don't see how they could reconcile that. Remember, cultural units are not bound to the region, and anyone who plays their cards right can use them. So it's not as simple as making Bohemia playing and just making their cultural units factional. At least, I think. Leif does describe Castellan units here, which is strange because I thought Castile was going to be a shoo-in as the playable Christian Iberian faction, but now I'm not so sure. To really illustrate how these systems can be useful for inflating the faction count, and I mean that in a good way, let's take a look at 4 factions: England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Castile. Look what happens when you factor in the internal vassals and cultural units. Obviously the mileage varies, any internal vassal that doesn't have cultural units isn't really as defined here, but still, look at this, it makes the list like 6 times bigger. Now, if we're talking true playable factions, I decided to put a list together. How many iconic factions would you need to cover all the areas? I ended up with 16, and you might be able to justify cutting 1 or 2 of them. Is it perfect? No. Every area has some notable faction that's not playable, but I do think it's a good baseline, and just imagine how many more quasi-factions could also be featured from this lineup. For example, due to how things were this particular year, playing as the Seljuks, that would also give you the Abbasids and the Khwarezmians as quasi-factions since they were internal vassals. Hungary would give you Croatia, for example, etc, etc. Apparently the next Building Medieval 3 stream is going to be in June, which is precisely what I thought. and apparently it's going to be related to the cultural units in some way, and I guess the process of being able to recruit them? So does that mean we'll be seeing a glimpse of the campaign here? Will it be with the Holy Roman Empire again, or are we going with a faction further along like Castile? I hope it's a campaign build, because I'm just dying to see how a lot of these systems are going to look in action. I still don't know if my take on internal vassals is correct after all, although Leif hasn't corrected me yet, so maybe I'm right? We'll see. So yeah, that's it for this month's update. Before we go, I just want to put something out there. If you guys have any questions about Medieval 3, feel free to leave them in the comments. If they've been already answered, I'll simply reply with the answer that Leif has given. But if there's something that hasn't been addressed yet, I'll post it as another round of questions in the coverage thread, especially since I don't have any new questions this time. As you can see, Leif has reliably answered my questions. Maybe I can help signal boost yours. It may take a bit to get an answer, it might be a few weeks, but you probably will get an answer at some point. So feel free to comment below. It might be slightly longer before the next update video, because obviously I'm going to wait till after the Building Medieval 3 stream before I even begin to start working on it. And if all goes well, we're going to have more pressing matters with a certain long overdue anniversary update. But for now, I will see you guys later.